Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the wonders of migration. A couple of technology notes. So down either at the bottom of your screen or the top, it varies by device, but you should see a couple different functions. One is a chat function, and one is a Q&A function. So if you have any troubles with the technology or anything like that, or just a comment, go ahead and put it in the chat. And those of us that are panelists on this webinar will be able to see that and be able to answer you directly. And then we'll certainly be happy to take questions about any of the things that we discuss in the webinar today. And so as you think of them, feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box. We'll probably wait till the end and just kind of do all the questions at the same time, and we'll have plenty of time to take questions at that point, and we'll address anything that's come in throughout the webinar and then other things that come in at the end as well. So a lot of folks, I think, have been on our webinars before. So just really briefly, we're the Missouri River Bird Observatory. This is our mission. We are very conservation focused. Excuse me, there we go. And so these are sort of the categories in which we work. Quality habitats for all wildlife. Feeding the flock refers to sustainable, conservation-friendly agriculture. Bird-friendly communities is pretty self-explanatory. And then people in nature. So just kind of trying to get people outdoors and appreciating birds, other wildlife, plants, you name it. And so these are the areas in which we focus our work, which all eventually is for the purposes of conservation. So you can always go to our website, mrbo.org. Here are the four of us that are going to be presenting today. There's me on the left, Dana Ripper. Then we'll have Paige Whittick, our education coordinator, Zeb Yoko, our conservation science communicator, and Ethan Duke, who is also director and co-founder of the organization. So here's what we're talking about today. Magical, mystical migration. Of course, there are factual scientific explanations for everything that goes on during migration, but it is an amazing event. And to me, it's one of the most amazing phenomena in all of nature. We'll talk a little bit about all kinds of different aspects of it. So the evolution, the geography of it, and of course, the ecology and also physiology a little bit. So migration is something that a lot of people are very curious about. It's amazing that birds that are very small will move such a long distance. That alone is something that gets people really curious. And we'll talk quite a bit about that feat. So it's really amazing. I think that most folks are familiar with the ruby-throated hummingbird. This is a very familiar backyard bird here in Missouri during the late spring and summer and early fall seasons. And so the ruby-throated hummingbird weighs about 3.5 grams. So to put that in perspective, that's 3 to 4 regular sized paper clips or a quarter teaspoon of sugar. And yet this bird flies across the Gulf of Mexico during migration. It'll start on the Yucatan Peninsula of southern Mexico and eat, and then get on the wing and fly because there's nowhere to stop. So it takes 18 to 22 hours for this little bird to do this flight. So here's a map of that. You can see the migration path is in yellow. For some individuals that winter in southwestern Mexico, they do go the land route, but the majority of the ruby-throated hummingbird population actually does this trans-Gulf flight. So this is something that amazed me the first time that I heard about it, and so I like to share it with people. And we're often asked, well, what happens if they run into bad weather or headwinds? Well, they fall into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's an incredibly risky journey, and why would they do that? That's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit, about what the benefits are of doing such a perilous and risky thing. So in the fall, ruby-throated hummingbird migration is very different. They hitch rides on the backs of geese. No, this was a story. This was actually thought as to be a fact for a really long time because no one could really understand how such a tiny bird could undertake such a long journey. This is some banding data just showing a bird's path and the stopover that this particular individual performed. And you can see that this bird, you know, on the way back down in the south didn't cross the Gulf of Mexico, but it's still an amazing, extraordinary journey that this little tiny bird went through. So here's a sort of a schedule of what to expect over the next 45 minutes to hour. Paige is going to come on and go through the what, why, how, and who of migration. Zeb's going to come on and talk about phenology, which is all about the timing and sort of the temporal variation in migration. Ethan's going to come on and talk about science and technology in different interesting, cool, sort of modern cutting edge ways that migration is studied and tracked. I'm going to come back on for just a little bit and tell you how you can help these migrants and other birds as well, and then we'll have time for questions. So with that, I'm going to try and exit out of my screen here and hand it back over to Paige. There you go, Paige.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm going to talk to you guys today about are essentially the basics. We got to start with the basics of bird migration, and then we'll get more detailed as we go along with Zeb and Ethan. So the what, why, and how of bird migration. So you could define the term migration as a population of animals moving from one place to another that has specific timing and is periodic. So when we talk about bird migration, how we can categorize that is by looking at distance. But what I want to show you guys before we talk about those different types is this graphic here. So this is from the Cornell lab, and this is eBird data of 118 different species. And each one of those little blue dots is a different species of bird and how it moves during migration. So you'll see down here, the date will change and the colors will kind of change with the seasons, and you'll see these birds move as they move through migration. So it might lag a little bit on your screen, but essentially you get to see these birds throughout the year move farther north. And you can see them really kind of about June, they're nesting, and then some of them are already heading back down. And the fall migration they'll kind of take their time, maybe moving farther south again. And you can see some of them are still moving through South America, even through December, which I think is really interesting. So that's just kind of an introduction to see kind of what bird migration looks like, is moving north and then moving south. So when we categorize, I said the different types of migration, thinking about it in terms of distance. So you've got permanent residents. These birds don't migrate, and that's mainly because they're able to find adequate supplies of food all year round. Then you have what are called short distance migrants, and these only move a short distance. So you can think of that as like from a higher to lower elevation on a mountainside. Some birds will migrate just those short distances. You've got medium distant migrants that their migration spans from one to several states. So maybe a bird that spends its winter here in Missouri and might fly up just to like Wisconsin to breed during the summertime. And then what people find most fascinating and what we'll talk most about today are these long distance migrants. So these are birds that move from breeding ranges in the United States and Canada to wintering grounds in Central and South America. So quite a long distance, and there are over 350 species of long distance migrants in North America. So why do birds migrate? So I think most of you have a pretty good idea of why this might be. It's all about food, just like with a lot of creatures and what their behaviors dictate. Birds are migrating to move from areas of low or decreasing resources to areas of high or increasing resources. And those two primary resources that they're aiming to get are food and nesting locations. And you'll kind of hear us refer to the nesting part of their year as like breeding grounds, where they nest. So birds that nest in the northern hemisphere tend to migrate northward in the spring, where they take advantage of those increasing insect populations, budding plants, and the abundance of nesting locations, because as trees and things leaf out, you get a little bit more protection. And then as winter approaches, those northern hemisphere birds will move south again as the availability of food, like other insects and other food, drops. If you're a bird that eats only insects, you're probably not going to want to spend the summer or the winter in Missouri, where there's not very many insects. So you got to move to where those are, farther south. So the part that I find most fascinating about bird migration is how they're able to navigate. How do they find their way from one place to another? They aren't using a GPS, but they kind of have almost an internal GPS, which is really cool. So essentially they get compass information from, and all birds kind of do it differently, but they can get that information from the sun, the stars, by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. And I'll go through different bird examples that use those different methods. And they can also get information by the location of the setting sun and by landmarks, just like you or I might use, like, oh, you got to turn left at the gas station. They might use something like the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, to help guide them on their way. So one really cool example, I think, is this guy. And this bird is called an indigo bunting. And you may have seen them start appearing here in Missouri and even farther north, I'm sure. And these guys migrate at night. So you might guess that what they use to navigate are the stars. And researchers demonstrated this in the late 1960s by taking captive indigo buntings and looking at them in a planetarium and then under the natural night sky. And what they found out was that these indigo buntings have an internal clock that helps them orient themselves to a star, even as that star moves through the night sky. So indigo buntings and other birds that use the stars are essentially stargazing experts, and they're able to find their way, which I think is truly, really fascinating. Another way that birds find and navigate is by using the Earth's magnetic field. And I think this is one of the coolest ways that birds are able to do it, in a way that I wish I had, or more easily than using a compass. But essentially what they have, so this bird here is called a it's called a bobolink. And they kind of sound like robots when they call, so I encourage you to look that up after this webinar is done. But they migrate, you can see they kind of breed in far northern Missouri, and then they go all the way to South America in the fall and come back up in the spring. And these guys, the way they navigate is by using the Earth's magnetic field. And how they do that is that they have iron oxide bristles in their nostrils and kind of in their nasal cavity. And that allows them to have an internal compass that lets them know which way's north and which way's south when they're navigating, which I think is just super cool to have essentially a compass in your nose. Another way that birds migrate, and this is something that you've probably maybe even witnessed yourself. So these are sandhill cranes, and how they do it is they essentially use a group behavior. So you learn the migratory path from the other birds around you, from your parents and the other birds in the flock. And what's really interesting about these guys is, and this range map here that you can see, is it not only shows you where they winter and where they spend the summer, but it points out key stopover sites. So these birds aren't flying from here directly to the northern part of these parts of Canada and northern part of the United States. They're stopping along the way to gain resources, which Dina kind of alluded to with the hummingbirds. It's very rare that they're just gonna fly 20 hours straight to a certain place. So having these key stopover sites is really important. And you can also see from this range map that these birds are kind of following a certain path. And we call these migratory pathways, or another term is flyway. So the northern hemisphere, or the North America here, is split up into 4 different flyways. So you've got kind of your East Coast or Atlantic flyway, your Mississippi flyway, your Central flyway, and your Pacific flyway. And you can see that these overlap a bit, and the boundaries of them aren't super specific, but it kind of gives you a general idea of where birds tend to fly through. And I'll let Zeb kind of expand more on the timing and location and how of bird migration. But before I end, there's no way we can have a migration webinar without talking about the Arctic tern. So this guy has the longest migratory pathway of any bird. So this bird, the Arctic tern, travels from its breeding grounds in the Arctic all the way to its wintering grounds in Antarctica in the fall. And they do this trip from the Arctic to the Antarctic and the Antarctic to the Arctic once a year. They do that round trip. That's 44,000 miles. And to give you some perspective on what that might be like, it's about 250 miles from Kansas City to St. Louis. So it'd be like making that trip 176 times in 1 year. And what researchers estimate is these birds, the Arctic terns, they live about 30 years. So within their lifetime, they're traveling, 1.5 million miles, which is equal to 3 trips to the moon and back. Whoa. And you might be wondering, well, where do they go? What pathway do they take? So this is kind of what our estimate of the path that they take is. So they're traveling Antarctica, kind of bopping on over to Africa, South America, and then heading up to the Arctic to breed. They have their eggs, they have their babies, and then they come back down, and they might go all the way along the edge of Africa and head to the Antarctic, or they might fly across the Atlantic Ocean and go down South America. And I think this is super cool and really shows the importance of those stopover sites, because although this bird has special wings that allow it to fly pretty far with very little energy, those places are still very important. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zeb so that I can stop fumbling my words as much. But he's going to show you more about that timing and different things like that. So take it away, Zeb.
All right, thanks, Paige. Let me find my share screen here. There we go. Okay, so from Dana's outline, you may guess that I'm going to talk a little more technical about some of the scientific terms. I'll try not to get into too many specifics, but I will talk about some of the more scientific terms that we use. So one of the reasons that migration occurs is change is inevitable. Seasons come and go, and everything on the planet has to respond to these changes in the seasons. Phenology is the technical term that scientists use for this timing of events, and particularly the study of timing of events. Birds, other animals, and plants all rely on specific cues to start different phases of life or different phenological cycles. For birds, it's obviously migration. Hibernation is another strategy for animals like bears. And then bud burst in plants, so when they know that the leaves can start growing again in the year. As we've started talking about, birds are now returning to the north. That's why we're doing our presentation now. Many of the typical birds we see in our yards, forests, and prairies are migrants. As Dana alluded to, the ruby-throated hummingbird is one of them that's very common in our area. And one that I've been seeing more recently that has also just moved back is the rose-breasted grosbeak. So migration is a popular strategy for many birds. I'm going to talk specifically for most of this webinar about the waterbird and waterfowl guild. And then I'll also mention that guild's a scientific term for a category of birds that use the same set of resources. So like waterbirds or waterfowl is a guild, and it's just mostly the ducks and geese, and in this case, swans. One reason I wanted to highlight the use of this guild is they have some rather obvious timing cues. If you spend your days on the water and suddenly it's frozen and you're now vulnerable to predators like these swans appear to be, it may be time to leave. And if you eat something in the water and then you can't get to it because there's a layer of ice, it's probably time to start moving on. So that's kind of a preface to what I'm going to talk about here, what different kinds of cues there are that trigger migration. Birds utilize cues and respond to external stimuli to start the migration. Cues like environmental change, such as a sunset being sooner, so like say 7:30 instead of 8:30 is when sunset's occurring, is a cue driven from the environment that can indicate to a bird it's time to begin migration. So if days are getting shorter, it's probably a time that they might think about heading south. Another type of cue is response-driven influence. So rather than a hint of season change from something like daylight, birds can respond to explicit resource changes. So again, if all of the food is gone, if you eat mud bugs or fish and the water's frozen, it's time to find another place to go. This photo was from one of our photo contests, and it was titled Flee, and I think it's a pretty good indicator of when it's time to go. They see all the snow on the ground and the season's changing, and they probably, then geese eat grass, so they can't get to their grass anymore. It's time to start moving. Most birds use the common cues of temperature and day length, though, to start ramping up for migration. Different types of animals and plants use different cues, but temperature and day length are the major ones that birds inherently know that it's time to start moving. They have a sort of internal clock for it, which I will talk about more later. So again, both Dana and Paige have alluded to that generally migration is a north and south process. One bird that I'm going to look at in detail here, I'll show you guys, is the snow goose here. So this is an animated map produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it shows where birds are seen by eBirders and where they report them and when. So I'm going to start playing it here quick. Okay, so there's a couple different things to understand this map. We've got relative abundance, which acts as kind of like a heat map. So the darker colors are where more birds are seen. And then we have the scroll bar moving here that shows the different time of year which each picture is. So each frame is a different time of year. So I also use snow geese because we actually only see them during migration. So when they're moving through the country, because they tend to breed really far north in the tundra, and there aren't many people that watch them up there. And so when we see snow geese, it's only during migration. So as I'll let this play here, you can see there's big numbers that follow the flyways, and then all of a sudden they disappear around August where they're breeding up here, and then they pour back in, and then they stick along these river corridors in really high numbers as they go through the continent. So in the fall, in the last part of that map, you see that birds head south, and this is mostly birds head south. If you're in an area with lots of birds pre-migration, you may see flocks moving in all sorts of different directions at that time. And this is called staging, where groups of birds gather together before migration. When they're done with the breeding season, they're not fighting over a breeding territory, they're not setting up their turf, they all kind of gather together, and they will form en masse and try and gather all the possible resources they could need before they start these really long flights. So they're gathering en masse, fattening up before these long journeys. And in this process, they may oscillate, which is where they head back and forth, like north and south a little bit. If the weather changes, or if they see like there's a big, for ducks and geese, if you see that there's like a big rain event up just north, they may fly back north to that. There's more area that they can utilize, and then they may fly even west or east too in this process. So if you see birds heading in the wrong direction, it may not be for very long distance. It may just be because there's a new food source available. So again, these groups, a really iconic group for this part, talking about staging and flocking, is blackbirds. And oftentimes they can descend in large flocks on fields like the sunflower field or wild areas to find any food they can to fatten up for migration. And then I have another eBird Cornell Lab heat map of where they are detected, and I think this one really shows quite clearly how you see these birds are really far spread out at the beginning. Whoops, too far. They spread out really far. As you can see, all the color changes, so there's less density, so there's fewer detections, but they're in a lot of different areas. And then once the breeding season ends, they're still spreading out here in June, and then in August, you see all of a sudden they're condensing down, and the really high densities in these areas where they're staging and gathering their last food resources before they head further south. And then there's a whole pile of them that say in the coastal areas here. One important thing, again, that Dana and Paige both mentioned is that that birds utilize stopover sites. Stopover sites like national wildlife refuges are really important to bird success. This picture is actually a picture that I took when I worked on at Swan Lake. All of these green specks here are mallard heads, and then you see a bunch of them in the air too. I think we had like 10,000 on the refuge that day. Just really high numbers. They all congregate, and then they use these refuges to fatten up again before they start flying. So one reason that these are really important is quality stopover sites are crucial for successful migration. Birds can spend up to a week at a time at these stopover sites along their flight routes. And these refuges are specifically set aside for migratory waterfowl. Most of the national wildlife refuges in our area are specifically waterfowl refuges, and they're not necessarily the prevalent breeding grounds for these, so they're really important as stopover sites. And an important note here too is that with the projections where we've seen in North America, there's been like 3 billion bird decline where we've seen less birds. Waterfowl are one of the particular groups that are not among this decline. And it's largely because of all the conservation efforts that different organizations have brought about to keep them on the landscape. Okay, so after they go to their stopover sites, they head further and further on until they enjoy their winter in the tropics in a beautiful, lush place like this for some of them. And then some of them also spend just all the way to the coastal wetlands. Again, I'm going to harp on another conservation effort. This picture is from Ducks Unlimited, and they have done several restorations in these important coastal wetland areas in the Gulf Coast. So they go to either the tropics or just so far as the coast, and then they will start thinking about heading back north. So one may ask, why would they leave the South? I mean, there's lots of resources, it's a beautiful area, and there's probably food there. It doesn't get cold and freeze. And one other thing, they don't have these same cues that they see up north. When you get to the really central, the latitudes near the equator, the day length doesn't change that much, so they don't have that cue anymore, and the temperature's not changing, so why do they move? As Paige hinted to, there are tons of studies that have looked at this bird migration feat, and all of them, most of them, I guess I should say, I don't know about all of them, I haven't read all of them, but most studies tend to show that again and again that birds start traveling at the same calendar time. So even more in-depth than an internal clock, they have an internal calendar. Just even if they're kept in a lab year after year, they'll see these migratory birds get restless at the same times of year, even without the same day cues and temperature cues. And one of these reasons, as Paige mentioned, is going to be food. All of these new resources up in North America are now going to be available, these new plants and bugs emerging. So it's a really good reason to come up here. I mean, look at this. This beautiful prairie with all these wildflowers means there's a bunch of bugs there ready for them, and then these seeds will be available during the breeding season when they have hatchlings that they need to feed. It's a wonderful place to come and get away from these really busy tropical areas, because tropics are a hot spot where lots of things live. And since I was focusing specifically on ducks, it's important to note too, the prairie pothole region, instead of being crowded in these Gulf Coast wetlands, ducks tend to head further north into the prairie potholes, where basically each pair of ducks can have their own little pond, and they can run there and have their bunch of little ducklings and then be successful and then get ready to head south again in the winter. One duck that I wanted to highlight in our area is the wood duck, because they don't necessarily go all the way up to the prairie potholes. They tend to use stands of flooded timber or swampy areas near trees and with trees near rivers. So you'll see on this too that they tend to spread out across anywhere, again, in the major river corridors. They spread out really far, and then they also will do this staging where they'll pile in together and then all fly south together. And then they'll hang out in the Gulf Coast areas, and then also the southern Atlantic coast. Spring migration is not exactly the same as the fall. Migration routes do differ a little bit, and then the flocks are different too. Oftentimes in the songbirds, the males will head north first and set up these breeding territories in those prairie areas, kind of set up their turf before the females fly in. Because there's a difference between the genders, the flocks tend to be organized a little bit differently, and they might fly different paths. And for that, Ethan will tell you more about how we know and how we track this. So I will pass off to Ethan.
Hi, everybody. I'll do a screen share here and share my presentation. so we can see the topic here. So we've been fascinated with migration for such a long time. Um, it's been a topic of study for hundreds of years. If you're interested in history, I would suggest looking into that, because that's a whole nother topic. But I'd like to talk about the future and how we track migration now, how we're starting to track it more, and maybe some useful tools for you to give you an opportunity to actually find the best places, or plan your timing to where you can maximize your chances of seeing some of these wonderful migrants.
Sorry, someone just took a cord out of my computer. Okay, so I'm going to talk about mainly two different types of technology. One is a resource through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology called Birdcast. They give you real-time live migration maps as well as migration forecasts. And I guess I'll start with that. And so we'll kind of look at this Birdcast actual radar using migration. And I'll say that they're actually focused on a network of radar stations to give you this data of bird movements, but they're also looking at using night flight calls, using acoustic studies, and eBird, and integrating all these different types of methodologies for observing migration to build these types of predictive maps as well as real-time information. So here's the night of May 3rd and 4th. You can see there's quite a high amount of activity here. A high amount of activity is in the yellow and orange, right through Missouri on May 3rd and 4th. You may have noticed a pile of birds showed up that were all tired first thing in the morning from flying all night. And you can see on the 4th and 5th, that was the last night and today, or 2 nights ago today. Now here's the night of May 5th and May 6th. And you can see that we've got this cold front that's moving in, and you can see that it's not quite as busy. We'll show some other maps showing that as well. So here is their live map of actual radar. So what it does is it starts on the night before, and then it goes through to the next morning. You can see the time signature down in the lower left-hand corner. Remember, this is radar. You'll see a line go through which represents sunrise and sunset as well as time goes on. But you can see here early in May 3rd, about 10 o'clock, now 11 o'clock. Wow, look at them all show up here in the middle of the night. They're right around midnight. A lot of action all throughout the country, really. Ton of movement on the morning of May 4th, the night of May 3rd. And then we'll look into a day later. And so not quite as much movement, but some movement, but mainly in southern Missouri, not quite as much in northern Missouri. But we know that we've had some cooler weather move in lately, so that sort of helps explain that. So that's one way of we're using technology now to understand more about birds and migration. It's useful for us to maybe time when we can maximize our chances of seeing some of these birds in migration, but also there's other uses for this. Maybe somebody wants to propose wind development over a particular area. Well, if we use these methodologies to go through, we can actually really start quantifying where the birds are migrating geographically as well as altitudinally, and realize whether those placements are a threat or not. So that's a really another use of that radar technology. Tracking individual birds is something we've done forever, seems like. I know us at the Missouri River Bird Observatory, we've done a lot of bird banding. And we're able to determine oftentimes, maybe where a bird is coming from or where it's going to, or where it is when we band it. Maybe it's a stopover spot where we band the bird. But there's a real recent technology that's really taken off called MODIS, really driven a lot by Bird Studies Canada and their partners now. And this technology gives you a glimpse at actually not just one spot and one data point for that bird, but maybe a whole host of areas, so we can really identify where these stopover areas are, where their breeding areas are, what their phenology, their timing is. So we'll look a little bit at this MODIS technology. And so they're putting these little transmitters on these birds, and the transmitters are being picked up by a network of towers. And we'll get into that a little bit. We'll show you a little bit more imagery on that. But I just wanted to show a couple of thrushes. We had these two thrush species in our yard the other morning, right outside of our house. And Catharis thrushes have always been a fascinating study of bird migration, closely related to the robin. They'll fly like 300 miles a night sometimes. So, but here's two birds that were banded and had the telemetry put on in South America. And there we go. You can see where they moved. I thought I heard somebody's voice in the background. Okay, so here's a little bit more of an infographic on what you can see of these small little tiny transmitters. They've been putting not only on birds, but they've been putting them on bats and dragonflies and butterflies. And so these network of towers, they actually share all the information from all the different projects, whatever they're studying here. And so there's been a lot of really compelling, interesting research revealing a lot of things we haven't known about these species before in their migration. And so not only exact routes and where they're stopping over, but maybe answering other more deep questions about why are we losing certain bird species, because migration is a very difficult time to study birds. It's labor intensive. There's still a lot of unknowns about it. A lot of our focus has been during breeding season, but we need to know about the full life cycle in order to really conserve some of these species. For instance, these barn swallows here, we've lost 78% of their populations up in Canada there. They're very concerned about barn swallows. So where are they having problems? And so let's key in and maybe look at migration and see post-fledging if that's something that's going on. That could be a weakness in their life cycle. And so they've done some research here and saw that it's just a very narrow window of narrow chance of success because there's a very low post-fledging survival with the barn swallows, and that can be for a host of different reasons. But to be able to identify key points in the life cycle that we can focus on our conservation efforts is really important. Here's our wonderful white-crowned sparrow, which we just heard singing out here the other day, still here, ready to head up north. This study was up north looking at the impacts of neonicotinoids, insecticide use affecting their migration. And they have found that it does affect it, and why it affects it can be limited their food resources. Obviously, if they're insectivorous animals, they're going to suffer from not having a lot of food, and there might be direct results of the insecticide within the organisms, the birds themselves. But they found that it really slowed down their migratory, the timing of their migration. They were really slow. So I guess if I was really, really hungry, I wouldn't want to be flying hundreds of miles either. And then here's another use of it, looking at fuel load and fat on these gray-cheeked thrushes. So there's a stopover point here. They're hanging out and fueling up, ready to make this big continental leap. And they need to really fatten up. They need to charge their batteries right up. And they found that if they're able to charge up, they can make that quick trip. There's a chart right here that says the number of days between intercontinental detections. So that means if you're really low down here, it doesn't take very many days to get across. And this is, they're fueling up really well and they're making it. And here they are not fueling up really well and they don't have a lot of fat and they're exposed to all these perils and it takes them much longer to get across. That's why it's so crucial to have this habitat down here, even if there are birds up here. So another thing to think about there is how cool this could be in Missouri. And fortunately, we have a really great state ornithologist, Sarah Kendrick, who's been really working on a lot of different partnerships and trying to get this established. I've been emailing back and forth with her the last couple of days, and she's still working on it. But you can see that there's a lot of concentration of these towers, these networks to detect these birds with these transmitters throughout the Northeast, and it's also internationally available. But just focusing here and looking at Missouri, you can see some establishment of the corridor here in southern Missouri. And here's kind of the plan for having 2 corridors so we can really understand where birds are moving through, and we can share data with other researchers who have organisms coming from outside of Missouri and coming through, how they're using our habitats as well. A lot of this information can be found right online, really useful websites. You can put these in a chat for you as well. But birdcast.info for the Cornell Labs birdcast and their live migration maps. And the MODIS website's just modis.org. We can find some information. And I think that about sums it up for me. And I'll hand it back over to Paige and see if she wants to sum it up. Or Dana, I guess.
All right. Hi again, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again briefly. Okay, so, oops. There we go. Okay, so just really briefly before we wrap up here, I'd like to talk about how you can help migrants. I think that my colleagues here have demonstrated some of the perils and the difficulties, and how it's really important for populations that migration goes well. And so there are some small ways that you can help just around your own home. We've talked about food, water, and shelter at pretty much all of our webinars, because these are basic things, right, that any living organism needs. So I'm not going to get too into those things. But there's a couple different ways you can do this that we don't normally necessarily think of, outside of, just providing seed and suet feeders and maybe water baths or bird baths. And those things are really good and really important. But as has been discussed, a lot of these particular birds are migrants because of the fact that they're very, very reliant on insects or possibly things like nectar throughout their life cycle. So one cool and I think really fun way to help birds of all kinds, I mean, this applies to all birds, not just migrants, but consider the flowering and fruiting times, and use native plants. We're always encouraging people to use native plants, and part of the reason is because they have these different flowering and fruiting times that the birds are adapted to use the resources as they occur in a natural system. So an example of this is right there with this hummingbird feeding on the columbine flower. Columbines bloom quite early, and they're a really, really good early food source for our hummingbirds as they return to us. So encouraging insects, and this is another thing that is just naturally done by using native plants. our native insects are a lot more prolific. They're also a lot more balanced in a native plant garden than they are in an ornamental garden. So I know from having once gardened with ornamentals myself that like the insect balance gets kind of out of control, and you might have insects that are not, they're in too high of an abundance to be delightful. But if you use native plants, then you'll have a nice sort of ecological balance, and our insectivorous birds will be very pleased to use your garden. So one thing that we always say is, of course, keep your cats indoors. Like, this is not really providing shelter if there's outdoor cats. They are non-native predators, and I have to tell a story about a friend of ours in Texas County, Missouri, who has a neighbor who was very proud of their cat because their cat was fast enough to swipe hummingbirds out of the air and kill them. And now that we've seen the hummingbird migration, I don't think that anybody wants to have a non-native predator get a hummingbird, right? So this is another very big deal that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. This has gotten some attention in the national media in the last year or so, and that is birds striking windows. This is a particularly egregious situation that's pictured right here. It's usually one or, one at a time. But this can happen on virtually any window. And so turning off outdoor lighting to avoid confusing birds. Most of our songbirds migrate at night, and exterior lighting can be confusing to them. And then make your glass bird safe. So from a residential standpoint, that means something like these, which are called window alerts. That's just one particular product, but it's a way to help birds see the glass of your windows so that they don't go flying into it, thinking that they're going to fly into a bush that they see reflected in the window. So last thing I want to say is just to think about this lighting and glass from like a large scale perspective. Most of us at our own residences, if we don't have treated windows, we might have maybe 2 or 3 birds, and this is particularly bad with migrants. We might have 2 or 3 birds hit windows in a year, but multiply that across residences and multiply that across commercial buildings in our cities. We have a project called Bird Safe KC, and that picture, I'm not trying to be all depressing, but that picture that you see there is one night last October on one multi-building route in downtown Kansas City. So you can imagine that on a large scale, this is a really, really significant cause of population decline in birds. And it's something that is, particularly on a residential level, very, very simple to counteract. So yeah, please, if you have any questions about that, we'd be happy to answer them, or any questions in general. So here we are. We have several more upcoming webinars if anyone's interested. And we're always also very open to people's ideas of topics as well. So I'm going to make sure that, I think what I'll do is I'm going to stop sharing. We should be on gallery view. You should be able to see us. I think Ethan's going to join me over at my computer so that we don't cause echoes with our voices. And I see some questions in chat. So Paige and Zeb, if you guys want to unmute too.
Yeah, so a great question was put in the box, which is, most of the migration that we talked about was north-south. Are there any instances of lateral migration between north-south, like North America and South America, Europe, Africa? So yeah, so let's answer that. What do you guys have to say?
Yeah, it's great. Are we not? I'm not
No,
muted.
you are.
Okay,
You're good.
good. It's great to think about it as a global phenomenon, because that's what it is. And so it depends on where you are throughout the globe. But if you're in, say, an Italian bird, it's really hard to get up over these mountain ranges that aren't like our Appalachians that are north-south. They present another barrier, so they have to sort of go around those. But they have a good north-south migration. There's a lot of interesting migrations that occur all throughout Asia and Eurasia, and we actually have birds that go all the way up into Siberia from the Americas. So they're not a lot though. So proportionately with migration, it's kind of a more rare thing. But yes, we definitely have birds just bombing around the globe. So,
Yeah, I would say like really the only instances of west-east are some of like the polar regions where there's easy land. Most things don't try and cross the whole oceans that I'm aware of, at least. I think like the only
Not
like actual migration I can think of is the caribou, but that's not a bird example because they move across the poles. But for birds, I'm tapped out.
birds don't typically try and cross the Atlantic and Pacific on purpose.
Right.
I'm trying to think. I know that there are exceptions to that, but it is less common. That being said, there has been a lot of, whether it's nanotransmitters, as Ethan was talking about, or even just banded birds with regular old-fashioned bands that have exhibited east-west movement. For example, a gentleman that we know up at Hitchcock Nature Center in Iowa banded a northern saw-whet owl, and it was recaptured in California. Now that was
3 mountain ranges.
Yeah. So, but while extraordinary and interesting, that is a very unusual occurrence. So.
And I talked a little bit too, and I forget, there's specific species examples that will like change elevations. So like throughout the year, they'll go higher on a mountain to breed and then come back south for the winter. Can you guys think of specific examples?
Hummingbirds in Costa Rica do that.
Oh, for sure.
Some of the grouse species, maybe.
I could see that.
Yeah,
Blue grouse stuff.
If I remember rightly, I went to a presentation where someone was studying a more resident population of bluebirds, and they did it in Appalachia. So I don't know very much about the European, African, or Australasian migration patterns, though they look incredibly fascinating to me. But what little I do know, it's a somewhat similar situation to our birds that, breed up here and winter in Central or South America. So they'll breed in parts of Europe and then winter down in the African tropics or subtropics.
Similar natural challenges, like in like the Middle East, they'll go down through that little fork of the Red Sea where that pops up in there,
right.
And they really bottleneck down through there. So they become vulnerable in those bottlenecks to some human exploitation and stuff. So they have that additional challenge that they don't necessarily have in North America, but very similar patterns throughout the globe.
We have a question from the chat asking how common it is for bird species to go back to the exact same spot to breed each year, or site fidelity, which is awesome that they use the scientific term too. What is the site fidelity in birds? It's definitely a thing, would be my answer. How prevalent is really hard to tell, but we do know that there are birds that come back to their specific areas. If anybody else wants to expand on that, they're happy to do.
Absolutely. I think in a lot of our familiar species, that is extremely common for that to happen. My gosh, rose-breasted grosbeaks do it. Wood thrushes do it. Indigo bunchings do it.
Red stars.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I'm more familiar with thrushes, warblers, things like woodpeckers, which are more resident.
The rose-breasted grosbeaks.
Right, the buntings and cardinal groups. Then I am with like waterfowl. So I would just like to caveat is I am not speaking of waterfowl right now. But our songbirds, it is far more common than not. There is also evidence, though limited, of migration stopover site fidelity. And this is I believe, more common in waterfowl, and I think Zeb can probably speak to that. But it is also common in hummingbirds. So you'll hear people say, the hummingbird showed up today and it was right at the same place where I normally have the feeder, and I didn't have the feeder up. I mean, there's many people that have a story like that. And that's because that bird actually remembers where that feeder was and that it was up, and it expects it to be there, gosh darn it. So you better go fill it up real soon. And yeah.
And then there's also winter site fidelity.
Yep.
Too.
Yep.
And so those wonderful winter birds that you're feeding all winter long, your white-throated sparrows, your white-crowned sparrows, your Harris sparrows, juncos, they have that winter site fidelity. So it's interesting because you'd think it would just be that one breeding site thing that'd be the most demanding, and they would really want to return to that spot. But somehow they're able to navigate without a GPS, without Siri, and they get back to the same wintering spots and breeding spots.
So this is one of the reasons, one of the many, but that we're so concerned with habitat loss and habitat degradation, because if you're a bird or a large number of birds and you get back to a place, whether it's winter, whether it's stopover, whether it's breeding, and your wetland is now a Walmart parking lot, that's a serious problem. Like your chances of now successfully reproducing or making it, if you're on, your journey, are far lessened at that point, and that happens all the time.
Everybody knows how dangerous Walmart parking lots can be.
Indeed. Oh, we got a cue there. No, I think that's a great question. So we have a question that is, which people are welcome to ask as many questions as they would like. We're happy to answer. What is the estimated mortality rate for hummingbirds during northern migration? It seems like it would be significant given the distance traveled and the perceived frailty of the birds. Okay, so Eve's gonna look up the exact numbers. I do not know the exact number off the top of my head. I would suspect that it's quite high, but it also, I'm sure, fluctuates enormously year to year based on weather patterns. So, and also the age of birds, and also the quality of habitat that they stay. Paige and Zeb talked a lot about like the ecology of feeding and staging and needing to gather up resources to make the journey. So a hummingbird at 3.5 grams will almost double its body weight in fat to be able to burn that fat during a flight. And a lot of birds will do that. So they need really good resources wherever they're starting from, and then wherever they stop over. And if that's not happening, then chances go down again. So none of this answers your exact question, which is a percentage question, basically. There are a lot of different factors.
One thing that I wanted to expand upon is the frailty of the birds. One thing that is kind of a promo for one of our upcoming webinars I'll talk about with hummingbirds is they fly under the radar of other things that might eat them. So like if they don't have enough food reserves, it may be a challenge, but they don't generally get picked off as much as some of the other things might during migration. Because they're so small, they're not really a good meal for things like other hawks or things that tend to eat birds. Now, cats are a different story. If they find them right by your feeder and there's a cat right next to it, they're going to pick it off. But as far as native predators or things that are a typical problem, I don't think they have as many of them as some of the other birds may.
They're very fast too.
Right, they're really tough to catch.
Yeah, agile and acrobatic. Any percentages? I
got stopover data,
okay.
But I'm not getting mortality yet.
If you guys want to chime in when you find it, let me know. We did get another question that I think would be great to address too. We got a question asking about the typical altitude that birds use to migrate. Does it vary by species, miles per hour of wind speed can they tolerate? Yes, that's a lot of questions, and yes, there are lots of good answers to that. Birds use different altitudes. Again, I'm going to go back to my snow goose analogy just because snow geese are really easy to see. They're these massive flocks, but I guess they're easy and hard to see at the same time because they're sheer numbers, but they tend to fly higher up than most of the other ducks and geese that you'll see. They're the ones, if you see something way up in the stratosphere, but you hear like little honking or squeaking, almost squeaking sounds like, they're going to be snow geese, whereas some of the Canada geese don't fly up typically as high. And the overnight ones and the songbirds and the warblers, I'm going to defer to answering to the other panelists for that.
Hundreds of feet to about 1,000 feet. And it does vary by species. And as mentioned, many of our species migrate at night, although hummingbirds do not. That's one that doesn't. But so there actually have been a lot of studies on this exact topic because of the wind development thing. So not just the sort of average height, which I have typically heard is about 1,000 feet. But there's an enormous range, right, depending on species. But not just the sort of like average migrating height, but also the angle and altitude of like when they land and when they take off is fairly well studied, particularly in the Great Lakes. Things like a low cloud ceiling will cause birds to migrate at lower altitudes, which can be a dangerous thing in cities. So sorry, I'm always there's this bad conservation side to everything. Sorry, that's just and then what mile an hour wind speed can they tolerate? Okay, so again, that's definitely going to be a species specific number, but I will say that the study that I'm mainly familiar with is with thrushes. And if in the evening when they're going to take off, if the wind speed, I believe it was more than 15 miles an hour of a headwind, they would not leave that night. They would stay wherever they were stopped over. Obviously, anything's going to prefer a tailwind, and they make great use of it. So some of the birders that might be on this call might remember Missouri in, I think it was 2012. We had a spring where the wind just howled like 20 miles an hour out of the south, like every day during migration. And we got passed by a lot of birds. Another thing that happens is if it's peak migration and a lot of individuals are moving and they all of a sudden hit a weather front, so say they get to mid-Missouri, and we've seen this happen, and all of a sudden there's a north front coming down. They're coming out of the south. Something will happen that bird watchers call a fallout, and literally like a lot of individuals will fall out of the sky. They'll come down out of migration because they don't want to fly against that headwind, and it's typically also associated with stormy weather. So if that happens in mid-Missouri, or particularly say it happens around the Ozarks, what's going to happen is a nice day for birders, basically. If that happens in the Gulf of Mexico, that's a serious problem, right? So there's a lot going on with headwinds and tailwinds during migration.
Yeah, I think you guys answered that awesomely.
We got another one in the chat there too.
So that one says, we have a few waterfowl species and shorebirds using the lake behind our house, roughly 1.5 acres. Is there a way to make this more appealing to stop over or stay? Last migration, we had 12 species of waterfowl, and I would love to have higher counts. I'm going to go with Zeb. You got this.
So even though I said that the waterfowl are in a specific guild, they do tend to use different foraging heights. So like the dabblers don't use really deep lakes. So you might have more lake species if it's a lake. If it's shallow water, it's a different story. Shorebirds will particularly like mudflats. So it kind of depends on what combination of habitat you have there, which birds you might bring in. If there's open water, things might use it as a kind of a loafing area when they go feed somewhere else. If there's like a harvested cornfield nearby or something, they may try and feed in that and then come back to that lake as shelter later on in the day. But that's cool. I mean, with 12 different species, that's a pretty good count for
I think that's
a season.
really good. Yeah.
And if it's depending on who owns that body of water or that wetland, that could, if it's privately owned, you could pursue help with experts at the Missouri Department of Conservation and their private land services folks. There's somebody, you can find a person for your county on their website. And they can help and maybe even get you into a program to help improve the habitat there or have a management plan for it. There's all sorts of things you can do usually to improve a piece of property, from removing invasive species to maybe adding a couple more natives, more cover, some buttonbush, and get some leaf bitterns in there or something. So there's always a way to improve.
Yep, so either your county MDC office, or sometimes those people are housed in the county NRCS offices. They also have a lot of the cost share programs with the federal organizations for habitat restoration.
Cool. Do we have any info on the hummingbird?
I am not finding any sort of hard, what I'm looking for is something like 60% make it through, but I'm not finding that.
I find what they're theorizing, because they don't have the data to really say, this is that point in their life cycle where they're experiencing the most mortality. So they produce more females every year. Males just don't seem to quite make it quite as well.
Right, I read that.
Because they're jacked. But they find that they're really prone to collisions. And then they further think that window collisions and other collisions are probably very much underestimated because of the low detectability, whether they're scavenged by critters out there or they're just so small they're hard to see when people are trying to do surveys for them. So entanglements and accidents and those things like that seem to be quite a big effect on their overall ability to reproduce and maintain their population levels, although they seem to be maintaining pretty well. They don't seem to be experiencing quite the declines as they do elsewhere, but that does vary by geography. I mean, you get down into Texas and the ruby-throateds are really kind of taking a hit, although they're not doing too bad around here.
So I do have, this is from the website Journey North, which is a migration tracking. It originally started as something, a citizen science study and resource website for schools and things for monarch butterflies. But they include other sort of iconic migrants as well. So this question, how long do hummingbirds live? Most hummingbirds die their first year, which the highest mortality in any species is definitely going to be during its first year of life anyway. But once they've survived a full annual cycle, their life expectancy goes up dramatically. So 3 to 5 years is the average. Apparently, like once they've survived that full cycle, though, I think that the hatchier bird mortality apparently is very, very high. The record age of a banded ruby-throated hummingbird is 6 years, 11 months. So.
Male, he said, was 6 years.
No, just an average.
Oh, average.
I'm sorry, record. The record is 6 years, 11 months.
Okay.
So. A fun fact about them that I was just reminded of when looking up this information is that people used to think that they had no feet and that they never stopped flying and that they might die if they stopped flying. And so the scientific order that they're in is called Apodiformes, which apode is no feet. So
that's funny.
But their feet are there.
How do they cling to the backs of geese if they don't have feet?
I'm not sure how that was explained. So I'll work on that. I see who asked that question, so we're gonna find out.
Well, it sounds like
But it doesn't look like,
researchers may not know yet.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, if a bunch of them migrate over the Gulf Coast, if any of them don't make it, you're not going to find
You're
them.
never gonna know, right?
Unless you have just a
Right.
specific. The only thing you could do is try and do a survey and get like 10 with trackers and see how many of them make it. But then you have, who knows what happens when you have all that influence on them.
You can find them in the bellies of sharks.
Yeah.
Been known to happen.
Yeah.
All right. I don't think we have any more questions. So
Right.
thank you guys all for attending.
Yes.
We appreciate it, and stay tuned for more.
Thanks, everybody. Hope you get out there and enjoy those migrating birds because they're pretty awesome and they're moving through right now.
Right now. All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.